second reading today, St. Paul tells us that we have to make the most of our opportunity because the days are evil. We aren't just simply living in days that are evil, we are living in the days that Isaiah spoke about. The days when they will call evil good and good evil. And we have been brainwashed into thinking that evil things are okay. They're not.
Nella ricerca della verità e della giustizia. Imploro il perdono del Signore per questi peccati, per lo scandalo e il tradimento avvertiti da tanti nella famiglia di Dio.
Allegations of cover-up come to the Vatican, and Pope Francis remains mum. A former Vatican diplomat released a letter this weekend alleging the Pope knew 5 years ago about sexual misconduct allegations against disgraced ex-Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and did nothing about it until recently. The accusations are forcing bishops and priests around the country to address the latest in the sex abuse crisis from the pulpit.
Io ho letto questa mattina.
And Francis told reporters aboard the papal plane yesterday he read the letter but won't comment on it. The letter from Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano comes on the backdrop of the World Meeting of Families, where the Pope celebrated Mass and greeted thousands in Dublin. We will have a report from Ireland coming up. But first, details of the explosive letter by National Catholic Register's Edward Penton.
In a bombshell letter, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano urges Pope Francis to resign over what he calls a conspiracy of silence about McCarrick, and he asks the Holy Father to honestly state when he first learned about the crimes committed by McCarrick, who abused his authority with seminarians and priests. The National Catholic Register first published the letter along with LifeSite News on Sunday, as the Pope wrapped up a 2-day visit to Ireland. In the letter, the 77-year-old former Vatican diplomat says previous Vatican secretaries of state under the last 2 popes ignored detailed accusations against McCarrick for years. Vigano writes Pope Benedict XVI eventually sanctioned McCarrick in 2009 or 2010 to a lifetime of penance and prayer. Vigano accuses Pope Francis of knowing about McCarrick's behavior in 2013, but rehabilitating him, a claim of cover-up against the pontiff himself. Vigano insists cardinals and bishops knew about McCarrick's conduct. That included Cardinal Donald Wuerl, McCarrick's successor as Archbishop of Washington, D.C. Archbishop Vigano writes, "I myself brought up the subject with Cardinal Wuerl on several occasions, and certainly didn't need to go into detail because it was immediately clear to me that he was fully aware of it." Archbishop Vigano says his conscience dictates the truth be known, as the corruption has reached the very top of the Church's hierarchy. Last month, Pope Francis accepted McCarrick's resignation as cardinal, following a US Church investigation determining that an accusation was credible that he had sexually abused a minor. Since then, another man has come forward, and several former seminarians say McCarrick sexually abused them.
Edward Penton broke this story and joins us from Rome. Who is Archbishop Vigano? Ed, his critics say he has an axe to grind. Is he credible?
A lot of people say that he is, Lauren, because he comes with a history of standing up against corruption here in the Vatican. Back in 2010, 2011, he stood up against financial corruption here, and that's one of the reasons why he was sent to the nunciature in Washington, because some people weren't happy with the truth that he was telling. So he has a history of being a whistleblower. He has a well-known reputation as a man of integrity. In fact, his number 2 at the nunciature came out today saying that he's never worked for somebody better than Archbishop Vigano and as a man of such integrity. So he does seem to have a lot of credibility. Yeah.
But there are reports that he was sent back to Rome because he met with Kim Davis, who at the time was a clerk in Kentucky opposed to same-sex marriage. Is there truth to the fact that he and the Pope do not get along?
I don't know about that. I think they clearly have a difference in vision, but I think the Kim Davis thing was something which I think a lot of people supported, and obviously he did. But I think there were people around the Holy Father who didn't like that, and that's where the differences lay. But as far as any personal differences are, whether there are any, I'm not sure whether there are, but certainly perhaps a difference in approach to the way the church is run.
The Pope says that he read Vigano's letter, but he is refusing to comment. What do you make of that response? Was it the right thing to say?
Well, I think it's mainly a sort of stalling tactic, I think, by the Pope. I think this is the general way it's being seen, is that he's wanting to see what us journalists come up with and whether we can corroborate a lot of the allegations that are made by Archbishop Vigano in his testimony. And I think he was given such a short time that I think he said, well, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what comes out. And he's sort of handing it over to us, the challenge to us journalists to come up with the truth and see what can be verified and corroborated.
Many high-ranking Vatican officials, though, are also implicated in this letter. Is there fallout at the Vatican today?
Well, people are really quite quiet about this. There's obviously a lot of discussion whether the Pope might resign because of it or not. The fact that this issue has now gone global, the Cardinal McCarrick or ex-Cardinal McCarrick scandal has now moved from the United States to having a more global audience, global attention. But also what's being discussed is the safety of Archbishop Vigano. A lot of people are concerned, and he himself is concerned for his own life. He fears that by coming forth with a lot of these allegations, his life is actually in danger. We don't actually know where he's living.
So what is the Pope going to do now? You have Archbishop Vigano, who is retired. You have the Pope charged with making sure that the scandal is addressed to the faithful.
Yes, I mean, it's impossible to know really what's going to happen. These are completely uncharted territory here. I mean, we've never had this before. We've never had a prelate, at least in modern history, calling for the Pope's resignation. So we don't know what's going to happen here. But I think things are going to continue for the next days and weeks, and we're going to find out generally what sort of revelations can be found from journalistic inquiries, and whether these allegations can be corroborated. I think it all depends really on that, and whether this story continues beyond the next few days.
Tomorrow at the Vatican, a historic 4-day summit begins on clerical sex abuse in the Catholic Church. It follows a year packed with allegations from Catholic dioceses around the world. Now, fingers are also pointed squarely at Pope Francis. Victims and even high-ranking officials are accusing him of inaction. As special correspondent Christopher Livesay reports from Rome, the fallout is already tarnishing the legacy and the credibility of the man many call the People's Pope.
Although time has passed, Alessandro has not forgotten. Back in 2011, he used to go to church regularly in the suburbs of Milan. It was here that he met Father Galli, who was in charge of teaching catechism to youngsters.
Every Monday evening we went for group confession. And on one occasion he asked me if I wanted to sleep at the oratory. But when I accepted, I didn't realize he had only asked me. After confession, we went to his room, and when I opened the bedroom door, I saw at once that he only had one bed, a double bed. At that point, I understood it was a trap.
Alessandro says he was subjected to sexual assault that night. He was 15 at the time.
The next morning, I told my mother, the worst thing you can imagine has happened.
The family immediately went to the church to report the incident, with a very specific request.
We asked that this priest no longer have any contact with minors. Then 3 months later, we found out completely by chance that he was just 20 kilometers away. And he was in charge of 4 oratories, and therefore still around minors.
This family's story is far from an isolated case. Since the beginning of Francis's papacy, thousands of cases of sexual abuse against minors have been brought to light all around the world. Although he promised to deal with this epidemic, it would seem that 5 years after his arrival in the Vatican, his zero-tolerance policy seems to be at a standstill. Father Zollner is part of the commission set up in 2013 by the Pope to advise him on this subject. Among the recommendations was the creation of an official body to judge bishops covering up for paedophile priests.
The Commission recommended the establishment of a tribunal. We said to the Pope that it was necessary to introduce something like a trial to be able to punish these bishops.
In June 2015, the Pope approved the creation of a specific judicial body in the Vatican to judge negligent bishops. And yet, this body never came into existence, leaving families like Alessandro's waiting for answers. For 7 years, they sent dozens of letters to the diocese and to the Vatican, demanding an explanation for the behaviour of the assistant bishop who oversaw their case, Monsignor Mario Delpini. In this official report from the Italian Justice Department, he admits to having relocated the priest who was flagged for presumed sexual abuse, fully aware that he would remain in contact with youngsters. Monsignor Delpini was never chastised by the Church. On the contrary, the Pope named him Archbishop a year ago. We tried to contact the Diocese of Milan, but they refused to comment. In Rome, the Pope's right-hand man in the fight against paedophilia laments the impact of this kind of behaviour on the faithful.
Many thousands of Catholics have also left the Church, scandalized not so much by the sickness and human frailty of priests, but by the mistakes and incompetence of bishops and religious superiors who fail to protect children from these predators.
A crisis of confidence that weakens Pope Francis. In his recent letter to Catholics around the world, he asks for forgiveness from the victims and calls for a change of culture within the Catholic Church. Statements that are not enough to restore the trust of Alessandro, who has attempted suicide 4 times since 2012.
To protect their own reputation, they're willing to sacrifice the lives of the faithful. The institution that should guarantee morality, faith, human values, well, it's sacrificing human lives.
In 10 years, some 6,000 complaints of sexual abuse of minors from all around the world have been received here at the Vatican by the powerful Congregation for the Doctrine. Each file is under pontifical secrecy. The victims themselves do not have access to procedural information, and the civil justice system is unable to obtain any information.
These are the cries of survivors, cries of deaf men that went unheard for decades.
I was 6 years old. The priest led me into his room with candy. Then he sodomized me.
He raped me with a banana, then told me to take a Coca-Cola.
It was in the confessional. He made me undress, then molested me.
As children, they attended the Catholic-run Antonio Provolo Institute for the Deaf in Verona, in northern Italy. They're among 67 former students who allege that clergy physically and sexually abused minors there from the 1950s through the 1980s.
I cried for help, but everyone was deaf. No one could hear my screams.
Nothing ever happened to them. The Pope has never done anything.
As a young boy, Gianni Bozzoli alleges that one of his aggressors was not just a cleric, but the late Bishop of Verona, Giuseppe Carraro.
This is the same path Gianni Bozzoli remembers walking as a young boy. The same path to the bishop's residence. Now that same bishop is on a path to sainthood, thanks in part to Pope Francis.
A probe by the Verona diocese failed to interview any of the alleged victims, but cleared the late bishop anyway. And in 2015, Pope Francis signed a decree of heroic virtue on his behalf, a step towards sainthood. Pope Francis has vowed repeatedly to take sex abuse seriously, as he reiterated last September.
Benché sia stato un solo prete.
Even if it were just one priest abusing a little boy or girl, that is monstrous.
But there are many, many more victims, and the Pope has appeared off balance in his defense of them. Last year in Chile, Francis publicly dismissed accusations that Bishop Juan Barros witnessed sexual abuse of minors by a priest as calumny. Following an outcry of victims, the Pope apologized last May and accepted Barros's resignation in June. In one explosive case, Francis was accused by an archbishop of ignoring the past sexual misconduct of the former Archbishop of Washington, D.C., Theodore McCarrick. Last week, Pope Francis defrocked him, issuing his most severe punishment yet in the clerical sex abuse scandals. But critics say it may be too little, too late, both for the credibility of the Church and Francis's pontificate.
Victims of sexual abuse say the Vatican has been hiding behind these walls when they should have been cracking down on predator priests. Now, some say that same inaction could lead to the undoing of Pope Francis's legacy, and maybe even his papacy.
Francis needs to admit wrongdoing, says Robert Mickens, a veteran Vatican watcher.
It took him over a year and a half before he even mentioned sex abuse. I really believe the Pope has to come clean on this and say, I made a mistake. I, too, was negligent. And I think he has the credibility to do that and in a convincing way that could help change this.
Archbishop Charles Scicluna is the Vatican's former chief sex crimes prosecutor and a key organizer of the conference. He says it will include some 200 church leaders from around the world, as well as abuse survivors and the Pope at all plenary sessions.
I think that we need, as the Pope said, to come to awareness as church leaders that things have to change, that people have to be empowered to disclose abuse, and we are accountable when we come to address misconduct where it happens.
Does that mean defrocking members of the clergy? Does that mean turning them over to civil authorities?
So every allegation has to be taken seriously. Every allegation has to be investigated. Mandatory reporting laws according to domestic law available have to be followed.
So cooperating with local authorities.
Absolutely.
Scicluna says the church in the U.S. has come a long way since abuse and cover-up scandals erupted within the Boston Archdiocese, prompting the resignation of then Archbishop Cardinal Bernard Law in 2002. But globally, he says, church leaders need to do more. Here in Italy, the Vatican's own backyard, clergy have been slow to even recognize abuse.
Are there really church leaders who still don't recognize that sex abuse is a problem in the church?
This is not about the United States of America, it's about the Catholic Church, but we understand that the United States is a leader in child protection, and there are things that I think the Catholic Church around the world looks to learn from the United States. Pope Francis is on the record on a number of occasions expressing a determination to address the issue.
Is Pope Francis going to resign?
I think the only person who knows that is Pope Francis, so you'd better ask him.
Just this month, Pope Francis acknowledged more instances of abuse in the church, this time against nuns.
Ci sono stati sacerdoti e anche vescovi
There are some priests and also bishops who have done it. And I think that it's continuing because it's not like once you realize it, that it stops. It continues. And for some time, we've been working on it.
One more crisis before a conference that sets big expectations. Survivors like Pier Paolo Zanatta hope the conference will spark meaningful change and consequences.
Francis must use the event to kick out every last predator priest, defrock them and kick them out. Cardinals, bishops, priests, everyone.
And if he doesn't?
Then people won't believe in the church anymore.
Pope Francis broke his silence on Wednesday, acknowledging for the first time that clergymen have sexually abused nuns. John Yang has more on the story.
Anna, for decades, the persistent allegations of sexual abuse of nuns and religious women by Roman Catholic priests and bishops have been overshadowed by other scandals in the church. Now, decades of silence are ending. Last year, a bishop in India was arrested after a nun told police he had repeatedly raped her between 2014 and 2016. Many priests celebrated when the bishop was released on bail. He faces trial later this year. This week, for the first time, Pope Francis addressed the issue as he returned to Rome from the United Arab Emirates.
It's not something that everyone does, but there have been priests and even bishops who have done this. And I think it is still taking place because it is not as though the moment you become aware of something, it goes away. The thing continues, and we've been working on this for some time. We have suspended a few clerics and sent some away over this.
The Pope was responding to a question from Associated Press Vatican correspondent Nicole Winfield, who joins us now from Rome. Nicole, thanks so much for being with us. You published an investigation last summer that documented abuse going back decades and spreading across at least 4 continents. Why has it taken so long for this silence to break and for this to surface?
The first public reports were in 2001. The National Catholic Reporter did a groundbreaking report and provided documentation that had been given to the Vatican a decade before about the situation in Africa. So I took that as a starting point and decided that with the reckoning that was going on in the United States, that it was a time to really look at what was going on around the world as far as the religious sisters were concerned, and indeed we found that really nothing had changed.
And you also wrote about the forces that kept these religious women, these nuns, from speaking out, from reporting the abuse.
In all situations of abuse, there is a general tendency not to report, right? There's a sense of shame, a sense of guilt. So there are all those normal forces that we've heard over and over again in talking about abuse in general. The religious sisters, though, it seems like there's compounding interests that might have conspired to keep this quiet. Some of that is that the sisters have a real fear of repercussion within their own congregations if they speak out, especially if they belong to some of these smaller diocesan-level congregations. That order is wholly dependent on their local bishop. So if the bishop himself is doing the abuse, or if one of his priests is committing the abuse, there are real vested interests in not having this come out.
And as I said earlier, your reporting found this over at least 4 continents. Give us some idea of the scope of this, and I don't know if severity is the right word, but there are nuns who have been forced to have abortions or forced to have the children of these priests and bishops.
Sisters were reporting that they were getting pregnant, and in some cases even the priests themselves were paying for the abortions. So kind of a compounded, as far as the church was concerned, a kind of compounded sin. And then there would be the cases where the sisters would also give birth and then very obviously then be thrown out of the congregations. And indeed, it seems like the developing world has been some of the places where it has been reported at least more frequently than elsewhere.
Well, the Pope reacted to questions asked by journalists on the plane back to Rome. It was reacting actually to a publication last week in a magazine of the Vatican that said that many nuns had abortions or gave birth to children that were born after abuse by priests. The Pope also said that his predecessor, Pope Benedict, closed a monastery in the heart of France where nuns were actually used as sexual slaves. That's what he said. So he was replying to questions. He didn't bring up the topic himself, but of course nuns all over the world have been complaining for many, many years that they were victims of sexual abuse by priests, but that the Vatican and the Church are basically that there's a cult of secrecy, so it's very hard to get them heard. Now these abuses occur in India and Africa, in Latin America and in Europe, so basically all over the world. And of course this comes at a time when the Catholic Church is already under criticism for other cases of sexual abuse, most notably of child abuse.
Then I remembered the first time I watched the movie Spotlight. At the end of the film was a long list of cases and dioceses where they occurred, and reading about the number of children affected, and also later seeing the vast amount of money spent on settlements, tears of sorrow flowed. How could the clerical church have kept silent, covering these atrocities? The silence, the carrying of the secrets in the hearts of the perpetrators, the length of the abuses, we heard one last night, and the constant transfers of perpetrators are unimaginable. I think all of us must acknowledge that our mediocrity, hypocrisy, and complacency have brought us to this disgraceful and scandalous place that we find ourselves as a church. Yes, we proclaim the 10 Commandments and parade ourselves as being the custodians of moral standards and values and good behavior in the society. Hypocrites at times, yes, but why did we keep silent for so long?
Alan Holdren is our EWTN Rome Bureau Chief, and he joins us now. Alan, many faithful are hopping mad that specific action did not come out of this summit. The Pope unveiled 8 guidelines in his Sunday address. Let's talk about those.
So, Lauren, the Pope made that list of guidelines. He topped it with the protection of minors itself. Also included was preparation and formation of candidates to the priesthood, accompanying victims, boosting and reinforcing the guidelines that seek to implement measures for proper protections. And also he added in curbing online pornography and also sex tourism.
Is anyone calling this meeting a success? I know a lot of survivors I have talked to, and many faithful, are not saying that.
Well, here in the Vatican, they say that it's a step forward. Just to gather all of these 190 representatives of bishops' conferences and also religious congregations worldwide is a big step. It had never happened before. It really was unprecedented. Also, if they were paying attention and if they choose to move the ball also on this specific issue, bishop accountability. They have a framework that Cardinal Blaise Cupich of Chicago proposed to the group, which they can use to hold each other accountable, but that will depend on the bishops themselves.
Well, this issue of cover-up by the bishops is also getting a lot of attention. So how did the summit specifically address accountability? One group said that they wanted to immediately enact canon law that says anyone found guilty, no matter when, is out.
Yeah, that didn't happen, Lauren. Many people were disappointed about that. We did hear from Archbishop Charles Scicluna, who's the Pope's point man for investigating abuse accusations, and he said that he considers personally the actual abuses to be on a par with their cover-up. And he said that he expects that to be enshrined in law. He's pushing for that. And he said that there's no turning back from this.
He said the wrath of God, he's going to, I think, come down with the wrath of God. Do you think, Alan, in all of your extensive coverage of the Vatican, that this is a turning point for this issue?
I don't think there is any turning back, like Archbishop Scicluna said, Lauren. They have gathered around this issue in Rome. They've talked about concrete measures. They have public opinion and the voice of the faithful in the world pushing this issue, and nobody's going to forget about it. And to say that nothing will come of this, I think, is impossible.
Cardinal George Pell, in charge of financial reform at the Vatican, had to return to Australia to face trial for sexual assault. For the Archbishop of Sydney, this is part of a painful but necessary process for the Church.
We've had to learn this to our shame and be humiliated by it being exposed to the world, but this was the only way for us to move forward, to face the truth about the terrible things that have happened and the poor leadership in many cases, and to be absolutely determined that we're going to do better in the future.
A determination reiterated by the Pope.
A hard-fought court battle, partly funded by churchgoers, was aimed at avoiding this. George Pell leaving court a guilty man.
Cardinal Pell, what's your reaction to today's verdict?
His neutral expression resembled his appearance in the dock. Pell did little more than shift his gaze to the carpet as the jury delivered guilty verdicts on all 5 charges. The charges dated back to December 1996. Pell had just been installed as Archbishop of Melbourne and established a compensation scheme for victims of clergy abuse. The trial heard that after celebrating one of his first Sunday masses at Melbourne's St Patrick's Cathedral, he sexually abused 2 choir boys. The victim's evidence was given in a closed court, and parts of the testimony was read out in closing arguments. The boys had slipped away from the choir procession and come across a bottle of altar wine in the priest's sacristy, a room off limits to the choir. One of the victims told the court the Archbishop caught them swigging from the bottle. He said Pell planted himself in the doorway and said words to the effect of, "What are you doing here?" or "You're in trouble." The victim said, "There was this moment where we all just froze, and then he undid his trousers or his belt, like he started moving underneath his robes." The court heard the then Archbishop pulled one of the boys aside and pushed the boy's head down to his penis. The second victim told the trial he was then forced to perform oral sex on Pell, who also groped him while masturbating. He said several months later, Pell sexually abused him again. After another mass at the cathedral, he was pushed up against a corridor wall and briefly groped. Evidence of the assaults came from that former choir boy alone. He told the court he consigned the memory to the darkest corner of his mind for fear of jeopardising his education and his family life. It took him 19 years to find the courage to go to the police. The other victim never reported the assaults to his family or police. He died in 2014. At trial, Pal's defence barrister argued that only a madman would attempt to orally rape boys in the priest's sacristy immediately after Mass. Robert Richter QC described it as a hive of activity and argued that the overwhelming evidence is that the Archbishop is never alone in the sacristy. The evidence of the complainant is not supported by a single witness, he told the jury. The first jury to hear the case was discharged when it was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. The second jury convicted Pal on one charge of sexual penetration of a child under 16 and 4 counts of committing an indecent act with or in the presence of a child. Pal was charged in 2017 and returned to Australia from the Vatican, where he was the 3rd highest ranking official and one of the Pope's closest advisors.
I'm innocent of these charges. They are false. The whole idea of sexual abuse is abhorrent to me.
After the verdict was delivered, Pell was released on bail so he could undergo knee surgery in Sydney. Chief Judge Peter Kidd said it was in no way a sign of the sentence Cardinal Pell will face. It is simply a sign of the court's humanity in recognition of an elderly person who has been found guilty of serious offences to attend what is an obvious need for significant surgery. Pell is expected to be taken into custody at the end of his plea hearing as he awaits sentence. He plans to appeal against his conviction.
Good evening. Cardinal George Pell has plunged from the pulpit to prisoner as he prepares to spend his first night locked up. The disgraced cardinal abandoned an application for bail today as his barrister described his sexual offending as plain vanilla, and 2 former Prime Ministers defended their friend. Court reporter Eliza Rugg.
George Pell's final moments of freedom.
We got you, Pell. Got you, George.
Suffocated by a media scrum and protesters, the child abuser had nowhere to hide. Hours later, neither did defence lawyer Robert Richter when his client was remanded in custody to await his jail sentence.
How will he go behind bars?
I don't think I better comment on any of that. I hope well.
In court this morning, Cardinal George Pell used a walking stick as he entered the dock. The 77-year-old closed his eyes and put his hands over his face as prosecutors outlined the sickening abuse that he inflicted on 2 choir boys at St Patrick's Cathedral in 1996. These acts were humiliating and degrading towards each boy. A degree of callous indifference was exhibited by the Cardinal. The prisoner has shown no remorse or insight. In a 6-minute assault in the priest's sacristy after Sunday Mass, pictures of the scene revealed for the first time. The then Archbishop of Melbourne violated both children. And 1 month later, the senior church leader again attacked one of the victims. The Chief Judge described Pell's crimes as brazen. He had in his mind a sense of impunity. How else did he think he would get away with this? He exploited 2 vulnerable boys. The Cardinal's lawyers claimed it was low-level offending, describing the then 13-year-old victims as naughty for stealing the sacramental wine that Pell caught them drinking. There was no pre-planning. There was no use of an implement. The offending was very short. This is no more than a plain, vanilla sexual penetration case. 10 people provided character references for the Cardinal. These people love him. They describe him as a man who has a great deal of compassion, a great sense of humour. Former Prime Minister John Howard among those to show his support. He did so after Pell was found guilty by a unanimous jury. In another twist to the case, 2 hours before the Cardinal was due to apply for bail at the Court of Appeal, his lawyers withdrew the application, saying in a statement that he believes it is appropriate for him to await sentencing. Mr Richter was taunted outside court.
How can you sleep at night?
I'd even defend you if you were
I beg your pardon.
The Chief Judge was furious. An assault on counsel is an assault upon the court. I would want to see that person prosecuted. This is not a game. The maximum sentence for each of the 5 charges is 10 years in jail. Pell's team is campaigning for the average of 2 years and 3 months. Judge Kidd reminding the public, the Catholic Church is not on trial. I am imposing a sentence on Cardinal Pell on what he did. Pell will be sentenced on March 13, ending his former life at the Vatican and starting a new chapter behind bars and on the sex offenders register.
Cardinal George Pell sentenced to 6 years in jail for 5 offences. I want to bring in right now Brett McLeod, who's outside the county court. Brett, if you're there, what's been the reaction?
Well, I just heard some applause behind us here from a group representing survivors, victims of sexual abuse by those in the clergy, now including George Pell. 6-year sentence just handed down by Justice Peter Kidd. And that indicates, that applause behind me, that people are accepting this outcome. It was quite a lengthy sentence. He went into great detail about why he was sentencing George Pell in the way he did. And I think part of that was to alleviate some public concerns that George Pell wasn't getting a fair hearing. He said the Catholic Church is not on trial here. George Pell is not on trial here for other accusations against him. It was just for the 5 counts he's been found guilty of over 2 choir boys that George Pell molested and orally raped in 1996 in the sacristy at St Patrick's Cathedral. So just to reiterate, he did say that George Pell is now a serious sexual offender and he will be on the sexual offenders registry for the rest of his life. He also pointed out that this could be a life sentence. George Pell's 77 years old, not in good health. He came into court wearing with a cane. He wasn't wearing any of his official robes. He was wearing a suit, jacket and collar and sat staring straight ahead at the dock. The courtroom at 3.3 was absolutely packed. And continuing behind me, I can hear the cheers from those who are here to represent the abuse victims. Many were concerned that George Pell would get a light sentence because this was a first offence, because of his standing in the community. But in fact, it seems that from what Justice Peter Kidd said, a lot of those things worked against him when it came to sentencing. George Pell was a senior figure in the Catholic Church when he carried out these crimes. He had enormous control over those 2 teenage boys, one of whom is now dead. He died of a drug overdose. The other is now in his 30s. The judge he anonymised the boys' names, not released what they actually are. He did say one of them had suffered a profound impact as a result of being attacked by George Pell. The other one is now deceased, but from the statement of his father said this had long-term and serious consequences on the young man. He described George Pell's offending as brazen, brutal, perverted, had a callous indifference to his victims, called it graphic sexual misconduct, and accused George Pell of staggering arrogance.